application that I'm going to use to demonstrate local storage. Storage is, of course, essential for any application, and with local storage, we can store bits of data and key value pairs directly on the device. This time I'm doing an iOS application. So I've got my application open here, at least the HTML view of it here, and we'll change the title just to be consistent. And I'm going to remove parts of the template that PhoneGap provides that I'm not going to be using. So, of course, all this comes out. This as well. So what I'm going to do is create a form, and in that form, the user is going to be able to type some data, and then that data will be stored in local storage. So I could use form tags, but we're not sending this to a server. So I actually could just go ahead and put the form elements that I'm going to use. So let's go ahead and I'm going to use the label tag. And we're going to ask the user their first and last name. Terribly exciting, I know. So input type equals text. ID equals first. Make it very, very simple here. Use a little break tag. And we're going to ask their last name. And finally, I'm going to ask their age. And these three data points are going to be stored on the device on a semi-permanent basis. I'd like to say it's permanent, but of course there are certain things that can occur that can wipe the data. All right, so last is going to be age. So label for age. Just like that. And then input type equals text. If you're familiar with local storage for just regular HTML5 web applications, then this is going to look very familiar to you because the API is essentially the same. Change that little mistake right here. Cordova does include a larger API for a web SQL database. I don't like teaching that because the W3C abandoned work on the project, so eventually you're going to lose support for it. So I don't think it's a great idea to use that. And really, I'm in favor of, if you're going to use a database, to have it on the server and then use a service-oriented architecture to access that data. All right, so we've got our little form here. We're going to need a button to store the data. So button ID store data, and we'll put on here store data as the label. All right, so I think our form is ready. I don't think we have any egregious errors there. So let's go ahead and now set up our script. So here in the header, we'll put an opening script tag and a closing one, and set up our window onload anonymous function, as has been our habit, and documents. And we're going to add an event listener. We're listening for device ready. And when device ready occurs, we're going to call init, and I'm going to set that to false. Now, in our init function, I'm going to have to attach another listener to our store data button, because that's what's going to cause all the action to happen. So we're going to use documents, get element by ID. We're going to get our store data button. We're going to add an event listener. We're listening this time for click, and we're going to call store data, this time the function, and I'll set that for false. So our store data function is where the action is going to happen. So it's here that the data is actually going to be stored. Now you remember that we have a set of key value pairs. Now the only application that's going to be able to access this local storage area is this particular application with this particular package name that we set when we created it. So you don't really have to worry too much about cross-application security. That's handled mostly by the device and the operating system. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the first, last, and age content into local variables. So first, and we're going to use document get element by ID first dot value, because we want to get what's actually inside of the first element. Remember, this is the first element, but we want to get the value inside there, which is going to be whatever the user has typed. So then same idea for last. We're going to get the value there. And finally, we're going to get the value for age. Document. I use pretty consistent naming. Of course, I didn't have to ID these as first, last, and age, but that makes it easy for me to remember what's what and pretty convenient. All right, so now we've got those in local variables. So the next step is we're going to call off the window object window.localStorage.setItem. Now, when we set an item, the first argument is the key, and the second is the value. So this first here refers to this variable that's set on line 39. So this first right here is going to get whatever the user's put in this input. And its key is going to be first. So it should be first mark or first Fred or whatever the user puts here. Window local storage. Set item. Last. And last. What's neat on the Android device, you actually can go into the Android's DDMS view, and you can see the little local storage files inside the device's file system. You really can't do that as effectively on the iOS without going into your local operating system, but it's possible as well. All right, so this is age. Again, that's the key, and then the value is age. Key value data can be very, very powerful. All right, so now we've got that data stored in our local storage. Now, obviously, we can't tell unless we have a way of retrieving the data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add here, let's add a div. I'll call it result, as I'm fond of doing. And here with the div ID result, now I'm going to go ahead and create a button called retrieve data, or ID as retrieve data, I should say, that has retrieve data on the button's label. All right, so now inside the init function, which of course occurs when the device is ready, let's add to this init function so we're going to get the retrieve data button. We're going to add the event listener. We're listening for click again. This time we'll call a function called retrieve data, and I'll again set the last argument of the add event listener method to false. Doesn't really matter what order my functions are in. So the retrieve data function is going to get called when that button is pushed. And now I'm going to retrieve the data from local storage. So local storage has a couple of different methods. You have set item, get item, which we're going to use here in a minute, remove item, and clear. So this time we're going to use get item, and that gets the item by the key. So first equals, and we're going to use window.local storage. And then local storage takes an argument of the key, which we also called first. These are local variables. I'm declaring them here with var, so they won't interfere with these variables here. They're in a different method. Last equals window.local storage. And let's get the last there. And finally, age. Window.local storage age. All right, so we've got everything now out of local storage. And let's go ahead now and let's create some output. equals, so I'll just do first, and I'll concatenate to that the first variable, and then last, concatenate to the last variable. Make this very, very simple for this demo, and then the age, in which we concatenate the age variable, and then we'll set the result. Remember the result div, get element by ID, results, and we're going to set the inner HTML property to output. So remember, this result div is down here. And actually, you know what? I'm going to make a quick change. I didn't mean to put the button inside the div. I want that button outside the div. So otherwise, the button will disappear when we change the inner HTML property. Okay, good. All right, so I think we have everything we need. Let's just go over this again real quick and make sure. So we're going to start. We've got our little form here with our labels first, and then input type equals text first, last, and age. So we have a little form for the user to enter data. And we can then have the store data button. So the store data button, when we get in here, we add a listener to that, which is going to call a function called store data. The store data function then gets the values out of the form and sets them to local variables. And then we activate the local storage object, and we use the set item method to set items labeled as first, last, or age, these being key value pairs here. The retrieve data button will then retrieve the items from local storage by their key, create an output string, and finally display the output. All right, so we've got this all saved. Let's go ahead and bring up now our Xcode project, get Xcode loading, and see how this works inside the emulator. Looks like everything's up and booted here. So let me go ahead and we'll enter my name. It'd be much faster if I was doing this on the keyboard. For some reason, thought maybe you'd like to see it. 38. And let's store the data. And now let's retrieve the data. Looks like we've got some type of error. Let's take a quick look at the code and see what we can find. And I can see right away I made a pretty silly mistake here. These all should be get item calls. I didn't put the actual method we were using, which is not very smart. All right, let's save that and let's give it another whirl. They always say it's always the silly mistakes that you make, but at least that one was easy to find. All right, so here we go again. MARK, LASSOFF, age is 38. We'll store the data. We'll retrieve the data. And there we go. So we got the data back from the local storage object. Now, let's go ahead and make sure the data persists. So I'm going to actually go ahead and stop running this in the emulator. And I should be saying simulator because it really is a simulator. If we run this again and I click retrieve data, the data is still there. So we've been able to save persistent data within the HTML5 PhoneGap framework.